Hello, and welcome to the Future Shapers podcast brought to you by the Spaceship Academy. My name is Todd Gimbel. I'm your host. I'm one of the co-founders of the Spaceship Academy, and this is our podcast. You can find it, because you've already found it if you're watching or listening, on our YouTube channel, on our website, on Spotify, Google, everywhere you find your podcasts. And we encourage you to like, listen, subscribe, and give us your comments because we really would like to hear them. Look, today I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, and I am so excited to bring to you Laura Francois, who is a double whammy. She is an amazing individual, has a great career and doing some amazing stuff, which you'll hear about. And she also was one of the original co-founders of the Spaceship Academy, which is even cooler. Laura, welcome.
Thank you so much, Todd. I love being introduced as a double whammy. This is really cool. It's really good to be here with you.
Well, you're a quadruple whammy. You've got many whammies going on. You've done so much cool stuff. Where are you coming to us from today?
The dark winter months of Montreal, where it's snowy and very dark, but I'm inside cozy, having this conversation with you, so it doesn't matter. Happy
That's great.
Indeed.
Well, we are thrilled to have you. Look, what we usually do with these podcasts is try to keep them cash. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and even like your relationship to the spaceship in the early days, and kind of just give us a little who is Laura Francois?
In a nutshell, I'm a Canadian who spent quite a few years, decade plus, in South Asia, working as an impact strategist. Basically, long story short, how do we make sure that when organizations, governments, companies, nonprofits want to create impact, that there's more good than bad that's created? Because impact actually is a neutral word. Impact doesn't actually mean good or bad. It just is. And so my job was just to make sure that it's weighed a little bit more on the positive side than on the negative side. And my background's in system strategy. So how do we connect environmental systems of trying to do good to the social and human rights systems of trying to do good? And it's a really fun place to play because every single thing on this entire planet can be explored through those two lenses, whether it's the clothing we wear or the products we buy, or even just the way in which we connect and communicate. So for a long time, I was working in the garment industry in South Asia. I ran Fashion Revolution, which is the world's largest nonprofit that's supporting supply chain transparency. So trying to make sure that we're transparent about our supply chains in the garment industry. Worked in Cambodia and Vietnam and Singapore and Malaysia, and then continued on to build a few businesses in that space, and really understood what it meant to work within communities on the ground to use some of these strategies. Like, it's great to say, let's be circular, let's be regenerative. But what does it mean when you roll up your sleeves and you actually do it? There's a lot to it that they don't tell you in the textbooks. They don't tell you at university. They don't tell you when you go to that really expensive seminar. And that's really where the ideas for the spaceship came about in the early days. It was really, how do we ship the nitty gritty that is not really outwardly spoken about when it comes to applying these thought processes and actually getting the work done. And so it was such a great experience to kind of condense a lot of the learnings and create courses in programming and scaffolding for people to have to lean on when they're doing the work, the capital T, the big work.
Yes.
And since then, I've actually been on a really interesting journey of re-looking at my work as an impact strategist, what it means to be working in the impact space, and had this really big aha moment about how often and how frequently I was using guilt and shame to do my work, whether it was in nonprofits, whether it was as a founder, whether it was mentoring other founders. Everything was about, how do you get people to change behavior through guilt and shame? It was just the biggest flex of the climate space and some of the social movement spaces that I've been in. And I think it's one that we all recognize, whether it's Greenpeace trying to make us feel like the world is burning, or whether it's, this is everywhere, and these narratives are perpetuating each other. And I just realized that it wasn't working for me. It was burning me out, but it was also not working for the communities I was working with. It would work for a little while, and then people get really tired of it. And that's where I discovered, I was actually thinking about, well, when did it work? What were the things I did do where it did work? And I thought back to some of the art installations that I had built alongside a couple artists when I was working in the garment factories in Cambodia, when I was working in Egypt in supply chain transparency stuff. We had built installations to try to communicate what we were doing, what the
Mm-hmm.
policy was trying to do, what the inner workings of these large PDF documents were trying to say. And the art made people reflect, metabolize the information, and actually take action much quicker than any of the other work that we had ever done. And I realized then that that emotion that someone felt in experiencing the art was actually awe. And it wasn't inspiration, it wasn't happiness, it wasn't joy, it wasn't fear. It was this feeling of being in the presence of something really vast that completely changed your sense of the world. And that was super powerful. And now I've been basically running an organization and building out frameworks and I like basically creating tools for us to use awe in the climate space. That's the long and short of who I am and what I'm doing.
That's great. Well, one thing that you said that I really like is about the word impact, that it's a neutral word, but we kind of put connotations on it. It could be good, it could be bad, but we kind of like, when I think of impact, I usually think having a positive impact on something, but that's not necessarily what it means. And it sounds like in your journey, you've been in that impact space, but trying to make it positive as opposed to looking and dwelling on the negative. I mean, you have to look at the negative to get to the positive, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I even get that a lot right now when people say, oh, so you were really you must have been really pessimistic before when you were doing, your work, and now you're working on awe. So that must be really positive. And I go, no, actually, awe is just like impact, awesome and awful at the same time. Awe is also
Look,
a
you can
neutral
be in
word.
awe of a great tragedy. If you watch the news and see something terrible happen, it's still,
Exactly. COVID was awe.
yeah.
I remember that feeling the first time. Yeah. So it's also, I think that's I like the way you're reminding me actually that both of those like the awe thing and the impact thing are both similar in the sense that they're, I think, a bit misunderstood because we throw on the positive onto both of them and we like thinking of them in that way and we're used to thinking of them that way. It's important that actually there's that nuance.
Yeah. Well, I also liked, I spent 12 years living in Singapore and working in Southeast Asia myself. I don't even know if we overlapped. We didn't know each other there, but I also spent a couple of years working for Levi's in
Yeah.
the
Oh yeah,
garment.
it's true.
And you mentioned the intricacies of the apparel industry, which is a mirror of other industries, but you were like right down there in the nitty gritty where all these different things are happening in the supply chain in different topic areas, like you say, the social, the human rights, the environmental. Tell me a little bit about how, as a person in this, like down in the weeds there, that you kind of dealt with integrating and understanding all this stuff and kind of like if you push a button to say, hey, we're going to do better, use better, more sustainable cotton, you might be at the same time pushing a button that the labor situation is going to get worse because of what it means. How did you start to think about that and reconcile that kind of stuff?
I mean, you're hitting the core of it, which is, when you think of Cambodia, for example, this is a country that relies still heavily on the fact that fashion production exists there and employs a vast majority of the population, specifically women. And to get rid of an entire industry just so that we can 3D print our clothing. I mean, there are negative externalities to even what sounds like a really positive, like ESG strategy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's interesting. I think I remember the first time I recall someone telling me about systems thinking, like what is systems thinking? I think that's really what unlocked everything for me. It was truly probably my biggest moment of awe when it comes to my career was really understanding why when we approach any problem on the face of the planet, no matter how big or how small, it's part of a living, breathing system, just like our bodies. Like if I stub my toe on a chair, it can give me a headache, but my toe and my head are very far apart. How does that make sense? And in the same way, like every organization, every industry is a living, breathing system that is not stagnant. It is continuously changing. And so how can we possibly think of solutions that are stagnant or solutions that exist in a vacuum when the patient, so to speak, or the body that is going to be receiving those solutions or that tonic is constantly in flux? And I think as soon as I started realizing, okay, systems thinking is it's not a tool, it's a muscle. And if I use that muscle over and over again, I start seeing the system as a dynamic place much more easily. And so when I start learning about whether it's about like, okay, what does the community of garment factory workers think about this thing? Or how are we going to think about cotton? When we bring in new information, it's much more dynamic in my head. And so a lot of the answer to your question was, how can someone bring in systems thinking to every single part of their role? And what I'm realizing now, it's been many years since I've been in that space, the missing link that I was not using at the time that I wish I would have is actually the layer of what I'm calling systems feeling, which is essentially the fact that when we feel through a system, we actually can understand that system in a completely different way, in a really attuned way compared to just thinking about it. And emotions like awe help us open the door to systems feeling. And it's not a solution to all of this, but it's a layer that I don't think we use very often. Because when we think of like, we're working at Levi's, or we're working I'm a CSO for a fashion company, where does feeling what role does feeling have in any of that? But it's truly a strength that we all have. We're just not using it. And when it comes to thinking about complex, dynamic, living systems, feeling is that's like a huge key part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're saying that. I was thinking of reflecting on my time and in all the different roles I've had, and they haven't all been sustainability roles. They were different roles with a lot of different companies. The thing that got me from the kind of more academic systems thinking, which I probably didn't even have that, but now I kind of understand it, to the feeling part was I loved products companies because I love to go see the factory where they're making jeans. And you go to, I never did one of the factories in Cambodia, but I went to a factory in Vietnam, and making garments, it's like there's thousands of women there, and every pair of jeans you wear, you don't realize how much goes into that. It's not like some robotic machine that pops out these Levi's or whatever the brand is. And the more you can expose people to seeing and feeling and being part of at a factory or at a bodega in the Philippines versus living in your lush life in Santa Monica, California, where I live, those types of things I think allow people to be better at systems thinking because of the feeling part brought in, because they have experiential aspects to it that then they can say, I now, you can academically say, oh, we've got 40 factories, here they are on a map, blah, blah, blah. But until you go to them, you don't add that feeling part to it. You can't learn that from reading about, we've got 700 employees and blah, 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 and this is the power they use. You got to go see it and feel it.
Exactly. I mean, I can tell you what the word awe is, but it will not be the same thing as if you were standing in front of a sunset and you were feeling something and you were trying to describe to someone, it was a sunset, and someone's going, yeah, I've seen 100 sunsets before. I've 100,000 sunsets before. Why that? I mean, you have to be there. You have to be in that moment. This is nothing new, but like systems feeling, though I've coined this term, this is deeply rooted in indigenous wisdom. This is something that has existed forever. Indigenous populations of the world. I mean, I think this is the single biggest aha moment that our species has ever had, was the realization that we are enmeshed with each other. And when I say each other, I also mean literally every non-human thing also on the planet, the trees, the butterflies, the everything. And so it's a remembering. It's not actually trying to learn something new. It's remembering something of that has existed forever.
Yeah, well, and one of the interesting things that, as you say that I think when I've been a corporate guy my whole life, and sorry about that, but I have, and now I'm good. But
there's nothing wrong with corporate guys.
But the funny thing that I think of now is when you talk about systems feeling, the corporate people who actually understand that are the marketing people, because when they're trying to sell you something, they show you the nice sunset, they show you all these emotional awe type things. Buy our, granola bar, and here's this beautiful sunset you're going to see when you go camping and wake up. They understand that. But I think what happens is people who are in the other aspects of the corporate world, the supply chain people, the legal people, the HR people, they don't have that they don't think that way. And that's where I think things need to be upgraded, and where things like the awe exchange and even the spaceship can walk in there and try to
Mm,
help them to understand more fully, what's
yeah.
going on and how to see and perceive and participate in systems action and impact with a different set of eyes and a different mindset.
Yeah, it's true. Like, I mean, that's what the spaceship's about, right? It's about like, how can we bring the tools that will accelerate this type of action? The interesting thing is, I think we all want action. We're biased towards it, but sometimes what's most necessary, specifically, and I'm thinking of the departments that you're referring to, the ones that are maybe avoid, like
Yeah.
I'm looking at Excel spreadsheets all day long. The leaning towards action is constant, but what is sometimes needed is refraining from that and spending a little bit of time feeling into what it means to take that action or versus the other. So Bayo Akomolafe is one of like an incredible thinker, feeler. And he talks about, these times are urgent. We need to slow down because if we go, I mean, it's almost an oxymoron. Where there's urgency, we need to go fast. But the challenge is the faster we go, the less we feel. And that's gotten us nowhere good so far.
And your other point about focusing on awe to get people inspired, to get people engaged. I was just like yelling at my 19-year-old for being a slug. Okay. I was doing the opposite. I was like trying to shame him into like doing some stuff
Yeah.
that he should be doing. But you know what? It's probably more motivating to get people to act by making them look at the beauty, the awe, the what could be, as opposed to the why didn't you do this? Why didn't you take the trash out?
Yeah. Well, at least it gives us, I mean, I don't know about your side. I mean, I don't, I empathize, I am empathizing with you, but I do think that there's something important about having, like, it's not about trying to get people to feel awe so that they can immediately take action. First of all, awe is not prescriptive. You can't go up to your son and say, hey, let's experience some awe because I want you to get off your butt. It won't work. Everyone responds to awe differently. There are 8 universal ways we all experience awe, but it doesn't mean you and I are going to feel it in the same way at the same moment. What is interesting to me though is to move from a moment of awe to a moment of a shift, whether that's a shift in mindset or an action. I say that because it's not always the best thing to take the action. Sometimes it's literally about the shift that happens in your head. To go from those moments, there's a little bit of metabolizing that needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Moments of awe can leave us destabilized. It's essentially a moment where all of a sudden your understanding of reality is shifted, and that's not necessarily comfortable.
Right.
It is
And it
maybe
takes a
when
while to process. It doesn't
takes a
just like,
while. Yeah, it doesn't click in immediately. But why it's important is that more than ever, regardless if you're in the marketing or department or the ESG department or whatever, having a moment where your understanding of the world shifts is such a critical window, because in that liminal space of shifting is where we can get some really, really important work done. Because how often do we feel, even in my work, I mean, tunnel visioned into where we're supposed to go, what we're supposed to do, what criteria we're supposed to meet for this year, what goals we're supposed to have. And a moment of awe brings us out, far, 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 far out. And it doesn't last very long. But in that moment of being really, really far out, that's where we can start having at least conversations about where we can go next or instead.
yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. And it's a little bit like finding your why, only, it is part of finding your why. And
Mm,
what we have found in our education endeavors and even in my endeavors as like the kind of de facto CSO at Herbalife back when I was there is that people in those functions that haven't seen the awe yet or haven't experienced it, as soon as they start to personalize and understand why some of the things we're trying to do or the things that they could be doing, what
mm,
it means to them personally, as opposed to I'm an accountant and I look at spreadsheets all day. But I also am a citizen of the world, and I also want to see
yeah.
things for my kids and my grandkids. And I get it now. I see why they're asking me to do this. And I think one of the things we're trying to do at the Spaceship, and why we have someone like you as a Spaceship fellow, is here's some really big picture stuff that people can think about. They can think about that. We've got, a lot of the people who are doing,
Mm,
but we also then have people who can kind of come in behind that and say, okay, now that you've kind of found that, how do we take that and convert it into actions and impacts that become positive impacts and goals and all those things. So tell me a little bit about, like, I know you work with a lot of different folks. How do you find the combinations of like what you're doing with some of the more, academic folks and others as kind of a total way to make things happen?
Yeah, it's hard because I'm treading this line. It's almost like I have this hat that I've worn for a really long time that has to do exactly with what you're saying, the implementation. It's okay, how do we make this real? And then how do we measure it? And then what happens next? And that was a hat I wore for a really long time, and I still put it on, so it still fits me, but I just haven't worn it for a little bit. And so now I'm focused on, well, the beginning part, before you even get someone to buy into the plan or create the plan or know where you're going to go, let's make awe part of that initial moment, instead of an organization or a founder going, wow, we have to figure out how to get B Corp certified. So I'm afraid we're not going to be. So let's restructure everything we're doing so that we can make sure we have this, we have this deadline and we can meet this deadline. That's not a great place to start from. So if we start from awe, then how do we transition into? Just to be super clear, I'm not a researcher. I work with a lot of researchers who explore awe. There's not that many on the face of this planet, but there are some really interesting folks that I'm translating their research to make it applicable. And so some of the ways that happens is through a framework called awe-based change-making. And in a nutshell, it's essentially, how do we get from that moment of awe that's very physical, it happens in your body, to a moment of wonder that's much more in your head. It's about thinking, how did that happen? Why did that happen? That starts translating into curiosity. And curiosity is super important because curiosity is where everyone wants the I word, the innovation. Everyone wants more innovation. Curiosity is like that's the fertilizer. You need curiosity about whatever it is that gave you awe in the first place. Curiosity is perfect to translate into self-directed learning. And self-directed learning, I mean, you know this because Spaceship's all about, like, how do you get someone to be interested in something so that they themselves take the driver's seat and understand how that's relevant for their context, versus someone saying, hey, it's really important that you do this. Because as soon as, just like with your son, it's really important to take out the trash, or it's really important to measure your impact, everyone's going to go, yeah, okay, fine, I'll do it. And then the next year they'll either forget or it just won't be a priority.
They don't integrate it into their essence.
It's not in the DNA. So self-directed learning becomes something that I see people kind of flow into when they experience this awe and wonder. And it's also a place where you can kind of unpack, like what we were talking about before, it can be very destabilizing. So how do you unpack that moment of awe? That often happens in that self-directed learning piece. And that's where you can start getting really nitty gritty with, okay, well, what does that mean for the organization? And what can that mean in terms of creating a roadmap? And that's where my two hats meet and become one hat, I guess. It's kind of in that place.
That's the intersection that's not traveled enough. It's not crossed enough. Okay.
No.
Because it's been interesting for me. I've done the corporate stuff. I've also done like Climate Week in New York, where we linked up and I saw some of your great presentations. And I see there's this spectrum. There's the people on one end of the spectrum who are doing sustainability stuff because there are lots of regulations and they kind of have to do it and everyone's doing it. It's the right thing to do. And then there's people who are on the much more altruistic end of the spectrum who really are big thinkers. And my takeaway was, how do we connect those ends of the spectrum? It's kind of like politics. Like, how do we get the two crazy sides to meet somewhere in the middle and actually do something good?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. It reminds me of this. There's this acronym VUCA. I can't remember who it is that said this, but it's basically stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Basically, the world we live in is defined by those four things right now. Except that we're living in a system that was built on promises of certainty, predictability, infinite growth. And so there's those two forces that are really, and I think of those forces when I think of what you just brought up, which is like, there's the regulation side, which is very much about certainty. And like, if you do this, it won't be volatile. If we're able to like check off these sustainability boxes and these regulation boxes, then we have no ambiguity. But the truth is, we are living in a time where those boxes actually mean it's evolving and it doesn't mean very much. The challenge is really bridging those two worlds, because the sooner we face the fact that we don't actually live in a place where those two worlds are separate, they're enmeshed, it'll be a lot easier, I think, to accept the fact that the only way forward is a way forward that requires both the thinking and the feeling about this at the same time, which is challenging in a boardroom setting or like
Yeah,
in
well, I
any
mean,
corporate setting.
but I do think that the way you make it happen is you get a hold of a couple people who are boardroom type people who latch onto this and say, wow, I get it. Like I just saw like a video, I was watching, there's a Netflix documentary called Buy This or Buy Now that talks about trash and waste and how we're being forced to buy way more than we need. And it's really worth a watch. And they interviewed Paul Pullman, who was the former CEO of Unilever. And he was a big thinker. I mean, he took Unilever from just another big company into really believing that they could try to make a positive impact in the sustainability space. But there aren't a lot of him. But it's partially, I think, because maybe the right people aren't knocking on those doors to try to convert or enlighten people who are in those positions. If you're preaching to, a bunch of people who already are signed up for a seminar on consciousness, they've already decided they want to see what that is. It's the people who don't sign up that you need to try to figure out how to get to.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And it's, I think there's not very many people because it's deeply uncomfortable. Like that's the other truth. Like if we're going to speak really plainly, Todd, I feel like the elephant in the room is that we are like the consequences of what business has been as usual there are unavoidable consequences at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And those consequences are not just ecological, they're also like psychological. Like we're feeling eco-anxious. Like I don't know anyone in any position who's not at least thought once about the end of the world, so to speak, or the end of the world as we know it. And so to step up to the plate and say, yeah, I'm up for this challenge is also a huge psychological challenge. And I think the elephant in the room that I keep thinking about is actually the Hospicing Modernity book by Vanessa Andreotti. She's amazing. She's a researcher at University of Victoria, and she talks about hospicing, like truly like end of life care for the modern system we live in. And it's important to acknowledge that it is currently dying. And there are two choices that we have. We can either let it die by the roadside, or we can try to let it die with dignity and with love and with care. And what does that look like? How can we all become like death doulas, so to speak, to support the dying of this current system? That's going to require the people in the boardrooms, the Unilevers of the world, to also acknowledge that there are parts of what it is that they've done as usual that is dying. And it's going to take a very different emotional space to be okay with shifting to a different, like literally composting and decomposing what's left and then figure out the next phase.
That's fascinating. And I will make sure we put the name of that book in the notes, because it sounds fascinating and I definitely want to read it. Changing gears a little bit, but not totally. I just heard, and I mentioned this to you when we were talking earlier, a great podcast you did with our friend from Future.io, Harold Newhart. And that's interesting because his group is CSOs from some of the biggest companies in the world, both in Europe and the US. And you and I were at one of his events, and he's doing a great job of bringing those people together who are kind of the entry points into big companies. If you're a CSO at a big company, at some point you're there because you really believe in what you're doing, not because you went to CSO school and it's a great way to make a fortune. Because there's no such school. You were on, tell me a little, because you were on there with I know Fanny Alliers, who's another one of the Spaceship Fellows, and another woman. What kind of message would you have to CSOs as to how they can better engage and be more effective in their organizations at being the change and at being impactful and all the good things you're talking about?
You know, I said it in that conversation on that podcast, and I'll say a different version of it, but it still feels very relevant and resonant in my mind, which is just that if you're a CSO in any organization, you are responsible for far more than the sustainability of the organization. You become the cultural master for what it even means to care about sustainability. Everyone's looking to you and putting on your shoulders like the modeling of what it means to embody that. And that's way too much, first of all, for one person.
Yeah.
So if you're feeling burnout and overwhelm and complete, if, it's nearing the end of the year, if you're feeling like you're tapped out, that's completely normal. And understandable. I think if I even can call it advice, I almost just feel like it's a nudge or an offering. It's that you, as someone who represents the culture of sustainability or whatever it is that you call it in your organization, take into account the feeling side of what that means, because people will typically have two reactions when it comes to sustainability related stuff in an organization. And one is it's not my department, so has nothing to do with me,
Right.
which just makes your job really challenging, because what you're doing is you're supposed to be infiltrating every single department and be part of like literally the veins and the arteries of everything. Or it's, oh my gosh, what you're doing is so important and I don't know how to contribute because I am just a marketing person, or I am just the tax human, or I am whatever. And so what you become kind of the movement maker. You are the person who is leading a movement within the organization to make people feel like they have buy-in and they have agency to help you on your mission. So you're like a Robin Hood, get people to be involved, and then use feeling, use awe as an ingredient, because speaking about the facts and showing another PowerPoint with a statistic or a photo of a turtle choking on a piece of plastic is no longer working.
That's true.
So bringing feeling into every single way in which you're creating that movement, I think will maybe create new pathways for connection for folks that are wanting to be part of what you're doing.
And that is so well said. I told you I was kind of the de facto CSO for a couple of years building a program. And my biggest challenge wasn't me having the motivation to do it. It was fighting the headwinds of people who didn't want us to do it at all because it wasn't going to make them any money. And to your point, fighting not the headwinds, and not even apathy, but just people not knowing. So this is where education comes in, because I personally had to reach out and hand educate all these different people at my peer level, above me, below me, in factories, say, here's why we're doing this and here's what it means to you. And that kind of hand to hand doing that, it was fulfilling because it worked out to a certain extent, but it was also very tiring, and there has to be a better way. And I think letting people be exposed in a small cohort or a medium-sized cohort to awe exchange or something like that, just getting them kind of over the hump into personalizing and realizing that they do have, if you're part of an organization, you have a role, even if it's not your job title or your job description.
Yeah, you are part of every, going back to that living systems, you are part of the system, and every single part of the system, no matter how small. That's a great thing about system thinking, is that when you start realizing that any minor change in the system creates a ripple effect throughout. That's true of every that's not just a nice thing to say. That's true of every ecological system that's ever existed. That's a lot of that. Then the power is there. It's there.
Right. But it's also, to your earlier point, the system is so complex that nobody can explain it all to you. And you never know, if you think, hey, I'm going to do this. You can kind of think of some of the things that are going to be the ripple effect, but there's always going to be some unforeseen stuff that happens. And you're like, oh, we're going to tweak our policy on such and such. And you don't realize that that's going to screw up your policy or your relationship with your employees in Cambodia or something like that. Those are things that you need a lot of minds working on it, and you need to monitor it, and you need to have people kind of you can't take giant leaps. You have to take smaller steps, because if you take a giant leap, you don't know what the ramifications are going to be necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah. And then every single part of the system becomes experts in some way. It's not a hierarchical thing, a system. So when you're making that decision and you go, well, who are the experts to help make this decision? The folks in Cambodia that are part of your supply chain become also the experts as well, because they are an expert in the specific part of the system that you may not know is connected, but is. So it ends up kind of toppling on its head, who makes decisions and who has the power.
And that, I think, makes the case for why it makes sense for organizations or for groups or for people, anyone who has a system that they're part of, to kind of bring in some folks from the outside, like you and Spaceship and others, to kind of, how can we help you so that when you're working on whatever you're working on, you're thinking of at least as many as possible things that you can about your system, so that you're not sitting in a silo and saying, oh, I'm going to do this tomorrow. Isn't this great? Look at, we did this. And then you don't realize it set you behind where it set you ahead in one place. It set you behind in 3 other places.
I mean, it's that classic, like, I was so close to the problem, I didn't see it. Like, it's, we all need that. I need that all the time. I have an amazing group of students that are doing like their master's project with us at Awe Exchange. They've chosen Awe Exchange to help us like explore some different challenges we're having as a nonprofit. And they're presenting stuff to me that I like completely did not even realize. I'm way too close. My nose is in it constantly. And it was just this reminder of like, yeah, experts they can be everywhere. It's people who are out on the side looking in.
And no matter how much of an expert one is, one needs other people to keep them connected to the stuff outside of their area of expertise, because nobody's an expert on everything.
It's true. Exactly. No one should be or wants to be. I don't know. I haven't met them yet.
So this leads me to the kind of the fun part. So you mentioned a great book earlier that you were reading, but what have you seen or read recently that's really kind of piqued your interest and kind of that you want to talk a little bit about and recommend to the folks who are listening?
Definitely that book, Hospicing Modernity, Vanessa Andreotti. It's just like, it's all about unlearning colonial mindsets, addressing discomfort and letting go of what doesn't serve us currently in our systems. Like, it's just a really good read, and she's just a really interesting human. But another one that it's not a new book, but I kind of keep referring to. I actually I don't have it on the shelf behind me, but it's probably because it's somewhere else in my house. I'm reading it. It's Emergent Strategy. So Adrienne Marie Brown, she talks about how small, adaptive, interconnected actions create systems change. And it's a really fun read. It's written in a way that is, I mean, it can make you laugh. It's one of these, it's not super dense, but it's really about this idea of emergence. We're in an emergency right now. And what we need is emergence, which is not something we talk a lot about, but it's this feeling of letting something emerge, like seeing what happens. Like, there's a lot of rubble around us. There's stuff that is actively dying or died. What can emerge from the rubble? And I think there's something really important in reading that right now, at least for me, because it changes the way I interact with, whether it's a CSO or a founder or whoever, because there's so much prescription in the way we do our work. Like, everything is measured out and planned and timed, and remembering that there's an importance in emergence. Yeah, it's just, I forget that from my own work all the time.
I love that. And I like that you said it's not dense, so that makes it palatable
to me. It's a fun read. I really enjoy it.
There's nothing better than a fun read that also makes you think and makes you act.
Yeah.
As opposed to trying to read, a treatise that is probably great, but I can't stay awake to finish it.
This one, hopefully you can. Yeah.
Well, that's cool. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, you are, I know you well enough. I don't know you super well, but now I know you. I know you're an optimist. Tell me, what are you most optimistic about moving forward? And maybe on the front end of that, what are you most worried and pessimistic about?
If I'm truly speaking from my heart, which I have been this whole podcast, so I may as well continue with that vein.
That's how you work. That's how you roll.
I'm not. Honestly, Todd, I don't know if it's ethical to be pessimistic about the future. I don't know if I feel in this moment that pessimism is a luxury. There's so much work that needs to be done. There are so many things that need to die, which is not a pessimistic thing. There's a lot of, when something dies, there's compost in the ground, and then new things can be born. So I don't know if it's really ethical to be pessimistic. I say that as someone who can be pessimistic a lot of the time, but I really have tried to reframe this for myself because I don't think I have the luxury to do that. And on the flip side, when it comes to hope, I like thinking about Buckminster Fuller, who's the reason why the spaceship is called the Spaceship.
That's why it's called the Spaceship.
It's called the Spaceship. Buckminster Fuller is just a brain crush that I've had forever. And he talked about being preoccupied with possibility. Like, I love this idea of being preoccupied with possibility. It's very easy for any of us to just criticize, blame. It takes a lot of courage and creativity to be in the possibility, like to just be preoccupied with possibility. And so I don't think optimism is naive. I think it's an act of imagination. It's an act of refusal to settle for the status quo. And so that's not a specific thing I'm optimistic about, but I guess I'm optimistic about optimism. I'm optimistic about us refusing to settle.
I love that. And I like that you said that pessimism is almost unethical. I hadn't thought of that. I'm sure, obviously, you've given it some thought, but it is interesting because it basically means you've given up. And if you've given up, why even be here? We're here. We're trying to move forward. There's no matter what somebody thinks or feels on this earth, whether we agree with them politically or socially or whatever, they're all here and they all want to be here tomorrow and they want to be here the next day. So if they give up, I mean, there are some terrible things they can do, but generally it's unethical because everyone might not think the way forward the same way, but they all see tomorrow as something they're going to be part of.
Exactly. It's not guaranteed, but we want it anyway.
Well, nothing's guaranteed.
Yeah.
Very cool. Laura, it's been a pleasure to have you on. We are thrilled to have you as a Spaceship Fellow. We can't wait to find some really cool projects that you can be involved in with us. And folks who are listening, reach out to me, reach out to Laura. The way we work things at the Spaceship is our fellows all have these amazing things going on, and we're not hindering their ability to do all that stuff. But what we want to do is bring a group of Laura and others together to try to help move the ball on some really cool things and projects. So it's been great to have you on the future. You are a future shaper and you are a legend in the spaceship world. And we're thrilled to have you back in the fold. And we will talk to you again soon, I know. And to you, thank you for joining us today.
Spaceship is always close to my heart. Thank you for having me here.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, everybody. We hope you enjoyed this, and we will talk to you next time.